so now for the main event. A man who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to try not to cry through it. So. Joseph N. Cooper is an assistant professor in sport management program in the Department of Educational Leadership and NEAG School of Education at the University of Connecticut. His research agenda focuses on the intersection between sport, education, race, and culture, with an emphasis on sport involvement as a catalyst for holistic development. He is also the faculty founder of Collective Uplift, an organization designed to educate, empower, inspire, and support students across ethnic groups at UConn and the world to maximize their full potential as holistic individuals both within and beyond athletic contexts. He has presented research at international, national, and regional conferences and published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, edited books, and op-ed contributions. He has also been cited in various media outlets, including the New York Times, ESPN, La Monda, ABC News, Yahoo, and diverse issues in higher education. He is a man of distinction, a child of God, a loving son, brother, husband, and proud father. You may not realize the amount of time and energy that he puts into everything that he does. I remember waking up at 3, maybe 4 a.m., pregnant and tired, to the tap, tap, tap of the keyboard. As soon as I open my eyes, barely awake, he starts talking about a model or a theory that he just read and how it connects to the current chapter that he's working on. And sometimes, in my half-sleepy brain, I'll process what he's saying and muster up something mildly intelligent. But most times, I'm like, babe, it's 3 a.m. But this book is more than 350-plus pages of words. It's a culmination of his life's work and deeply tied to his heart and his soul. It has been truly amazing to watch you produce this seminal piece, before tenure, might I add, which is a major accomplishment. I know this is just the beginning of your journey. I'm so excited for your journey and our journey together. You are my one and only, and I'm so incredibly proud and honored to be your wife. I love you more than words can say, so without further ado, please give it up for Dr. Joseph Cooper.
Oh man, well that's the end, folks. I don't know about you, but no, I love you, Monique. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. A couple of thank yous I want to say off the top just before I get started. First, I want to thank God. I want to thank my Lord and personal Savior, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit that dwells within me. I have a couple of family members, ancestors who passed away that I want to definitely acknowledge them from the top. My father, Armand Jamale Cooper, passed away in 2016 of stomach cancer. I love you, Dad. I know you're smiling down on me, and I can feel your presence here with me now. My grandfather, Dr. Henry Nehemiah Cooper, Liberian, from Liberia. Coopers are doers, so I hope I'm making Maya proud right now. My mother's mother, Josephine Johnson Egerton Wilkins, she passed away this past September. She was 93 years old. So Mama Joe, I love you, and I feel your spirit with me here now as well. I want to thank my living family members, obviously my shero, my mother, Dr. Jewel Egerton Cooper. She couldn't be here tonight. She's in Atlanta for a conference, but she will be here next Friday to visit her granddaughter, Nia. So I want to say thank you, Mom, for everything that you've done for me throughout my life, the sacrifices you've made, instilling in me the value of education, critical consciousness, and being an active agent of change. So not only talking about it, not only reading about it, but living it, breathing it, and being it. So I want to thank you. I want to thank my grandmother, Izetta Roberts Cooper. Mama, I love you very much. Look forward to seeing you soon. And I also just want to thank my bigger brother, Adam Roberts Cooper. He's in Greensboro, North Carolina right now, and he couldn't be here. But I definitely wanted to say thank you to them because in the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. I don't stand here by myself. I stand here on the shoulders of my ancestors and the ancestors of African and Black people collectively. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I get into the book. So very thankful to all of you for being here. As Monique mentioned, I want to thank Dr. Price, the director of the African American Culture Center. We can give her another round of applause. for her tremendous leadership, what she represents not only to the Cultural Center and not only to the state of Connecticut, but to the nation and the world. Her leadership goes beyond words, and I want to thank you for the love and support that you've shown me since I stepped foot on this campus 6 years ago. A lot has changed in those 6 years. I came here not knowing anybody, Dr. Burton, Dr. McGarry, my colleagues who were on the hiring committee, decided to take a chance on a doctoral student coming from the University of Georgia, said, hey, would you like to come to cold Connecticut? And I said, UConn, I know it's a great school, but I'm from the South. I grew up in North Carolina. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. And I said, I'm not sure, but everything has a divine purpose and timing. And that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit about as I go through the presentation. So very, very, very honored to talk about the book today. The title, From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, Black Male Holistic Underdevelopment Through Sport and Miseducation. This book is a culmination of research. A lot of people ask me, how long did it take for you to write the book? And I jokingly say it took my whole life. As a black male former athlete, and I am a holistic individual, that's how I identify myself. I didn't always identify myself as a holistic individual, even though I always was a holistic individual. So I'm going to talk about how socialization processes that miseducate us can lead to our exploitation, can lead to our holistic underdevelopment, not only as individuals, but as a collective community. So that's what the title means. The under and the mis are intentionally put in parentheses because I'm going to explain in the book specific conditions that contribute to certain outcomes where holistic underdevelopment and exploitation occur, and where holistic development and education and empowerment occur. So 3 reasons why I wrote the book, just to highlight. The first one is I felt like there was a need to have a more complex conversation about black male holistic individuals who participate in sport. So I'll say black male athletes because that's the term that you're familiar with, but when you hear that, I want you always to think he's talking about black male holistic individuals who play a sport. A sport is something people do, it's not who they are. When they're miseducated, they say that the sport is who I am. Right? The sport is all that I have to offer this world. And typically the person who's helping them is somebody outside of their community. And we're going to talk about that. Oftentimes when we talk about black male athletes, we also look at them in very simplistic ways. One, you look at them as the dumb jock, right? Athletically, somehow they're biologically gifted. They were born that way, and intellectually they're inferior. So that's one way that's a dominant narrative. Another one is this innate criminality. Right? You see in the media bombarded messages that say this black male engaged in domestic abuse. This black male did this. They don't ever tell you about the trauma that happened in that person's life prior to engaging in whatever actions they did. They don't tell you about some of the things that were impacting their life prior to engaging in those actions. But they talk about the criminality. And then the third one that isn't on the surface negative, but I'm going to talk about how it's negative, is how you view black males as exceptional. Right? The LeBron James, the Michael Jordans, right? We kind of look at that and say, wow, that's great. They're making a lot of money. They're doing well. But the reality is the way that they succeeded is a part of the system of oppression in and of itself. Within all systems of oppression, there are exceptions to the rule. That's how you maintain the status quo of mass inequality. The third thing, and the most important reason I wrote this book, is to highlight empowering strategies for the cultivation of holistic development and collective uplift. When particular individuals suffer within a community, it has a residual effect on the larger collective. So the fact that we have talked about athletics and education as dichotomous, and we really haven't delved into how athletics under certain conditions facilitates growth and development, and other conditions facilitates deterioration, right, and depression. And we're also going to talk about black male athletes who actually have committed suicide, right? We're going to go there, right? Because this is more than just about leisure and entertainment. It's about life and death in many cases. Other issues that I wanted to highlight, there's an under-theorization of black males in sport. In the scholarly literature, when we talk about, and this goes for everyone in the room, when you think about who you are and when you read certain texts, oftentimes you're going to read studies that were written by people who don't have your experiences. Many of them who didn't come from your background, so don't understand the nuances of the lens that you bring to the world. When we talk about black males, most of the literature prior to recently has used theories that didn't include black males in the studies, right? So these are studies that were done either in the United States, among white populations, done in European contexts, right? But somehow this theory should map on to black males in the United States, right? And understanding the nuances that come with the social construction of race, how race intersects with class, geography, family, ethnic lineage. So I felt like it was important to have a theory or have multiple theories that account for the complexity of our lived experiences. The other thought that I wanted to address was deficit-based explanations. Deficit means that you are the primary problem and you're responsible for your outcomes in life. I am admittingly a social constructivist. All that means is that I believe there are multiple truths, right? My truth is from my perspective, your truth is from your perspective, and I also adopt more of a sociological lens in contrast to a psychological lens. Human agency is extremely powerful, but your agency only operates within the context of the conditions under which you exist, right? Based on the knowledge that you have. It's that cliche, when you know more, you do more. One of my professors at UNC Chapel Hill when I was an undergrad, I was a freshman, first year student in a sociology class, right? And I was wearing my do-rag, trying to be cool back then, right? Some of the students in the class understand. And she told us in class, you don't know what you don't know. And I'll never forget it. I was sitting next to one of my best friends, Christian Rhodes. I want to say a shout out to him. I know he'll watch this video later. And we were in class together, and we looked at each other and said, you don't know what you don't know. Obviously, you don't know what you don't know. Later, as I matured and I developed, those words were so powerful. Oftentimes, people make decisions based on what they know, right? Based on what they're comfortable with. And when you talk about exploitation, when you talk about empowerment, those conditions don't solely happen based on individual agency, right? There's ways in which there are systems in place to intentionally miseducate people, intentionally there to create illusions of success. And we're going to talk about that. And then, as I mentioned before, a lot of studies looked at black males at a particular point in time, typically when they were participating in their sport or immediately afterwards during retirement. And I felt like it was important to capture the lifespan. I know that for me, my development as a holistic individual took a lot of time, right? I'm in my mid-30s now. It took a lot of time for me to come to some understandings about what happened to me, right? Because I had an identity crisis when my athletic career concluded. And I know many of you will look at me like, Dr. Cooper, you know, you're 5'9", you say you play basketball, we hear you, right? But I grew up in a state in North Carolina where basketball is very similar to a religion. I can name 3 of the top 10 point guards in the NBA that are under 6'6". Stephen Curry, John Wall, Chris Paul, who the last in which I played AAU and high school basketball with. So it wasn't a pipe dream for us, right? You can name numerous other individuals who are from the state of North Carolina. 2 of the greatest dunkers of all time, actually 3, played at North Carolina colleges. Michael Jordan, David Thompson, Vince Carter, right? So when you think about the impact of growing up within that context, that has a huge impact on black males, right? This idea of who am I, right? What do I see and what do I internalize? So I'm just going to briefly go over each of the chapters. I'm going to highlight the models. I'm not going to give you everything because, as Luce reminded me, I want you to read the book, right? But I just want to tease your appetite enough to stimulate some thought. So as you're hearing what I'm talking about here, I also want you to think about, like all of us, our faculty members in sport management talk about, bring yourself to this. Even though I'm talking about certain things, this is not disconnected from you regardless of what your identity is. Now, I do want you to understand that this was written with a focus on black males, and that's unapologetic. Okay, there's a particular reason. Some people ask, well, why don't you focus on black women? Black women are discussed in the book, but they're not the focus because I think it's important that the people who author certain texts have to have a certain connection to that experience, right? If I were to write a text about black women, not to say that it wouldn't be meaningful, but I also think that black women author their own texts, right? And they have merit in and of themselves, just as I do as well as a black male, okay? So a brief overview of the socio-historical. Many people don't understand that black males, when they, must be telling me my mouth is dry. Wonderful woman, wonderful wife. You gotta have somebody who keeps you in check, right? She'll tell me if I have something in my nose, babe, your mouth is dry, drink some water. Thank you. So the socio-historical context, many people, when you think of modern day sport, you think people chose to be involved in the activity because it builds character, there are social, psychosocial positive outcomes from it, physical outcomes from it. Actually, black males' introduction to the sport occurred during the antebellum period, right? So this is chattel slavery, the antebellum and the postbellum period, right? So the idea was that there was normalized oppression for blacks overall, right? This idea of having blacks enslaved, this idea of blacks, even in the postbellum period in Reconstruction, engaged in sharecropping, right? You didn't own anything. Somebody else owned you. You were in debt to somebody else. So the idea was if you participate in boxing, you participate in horse racing, right, for white pleasure, right? You entertain us, you're riding for us, you don't own anything, we're going to give you certain benefits. That's an important impetus to understand black participation in sport within the United States. Because black male participation in sport wasn't based on just an innate desire to participate in sport. It wasn't just because my identity is connected to this. It was this idea that I can receive some resemblance of humanity by engaging in this activity. That's a very important point to understand, because that psychological affinity that we see today, it's not because we just automatically think that we're gifted in the sport. This goes back, what I talk about, there's a sociological term called collective memory, right? And this process occurs over time when there's systems that operate in a certain way within your family. There's another term related to that called epigenetics, right? This notion that this is how certain things perpetuate over time. Even when the actors and the actresses in a particular setting change, certain things continue to reproduce. You ask yourself, well, if there are new people who are in a position, how does the same inequality exist? It's through collective memory, right? So that's where it talks about. At the turn of the century, Edwin Bancroft Henderson, he's considered the father of black basketball. He introduced this term called Muscular Assimilationism. And he was one of the leaders in the black community during the early 1900s. Keep in mind the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Urban League, fraternities and sororities. Many of these organizations were created during this same time frame. So this is pre-civil rights movement, but it was this idea that muscular assimilationism is if we can demonstrate that we can be successful and gifted in this sporting space, these physical activities, maybe those who are in power, whites, will begin to accept us in the larger society, right? So we began to create our own leagues, right? The Black Negro leagues, which was black baseball, because blacks were largely excluded from baseball. Even though Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, there were select black males such as Moses Fleetwood Walker who were allowed to participate during the late 1800s and early 1900s. But remember, blacks were selectively allowed to participate. You weren't allowed to have ownership. You weren't allowed to have management. Your communities weren't all inclusive. We're going to select a few of you to come and participate on our teams. Eerily similar to the modern day, right? 2019, 0% black ownership in the NFL, right? Less than 1% ownership in the NBA, right? Yet over 70%, sometimes 80% on any given year constitute the labor force. And we're not even going to start with Division I intercollegiate athletics, right? So we'll get into that. The rise and decline of cultural nationalism. This was the first time in U.S. history, because remember, prior to this point, modern day sport wasn't created. The NFL was started in 1920. The NBA was started shortly there. The NBA was started shortly thereafter. So organized sport in the way that we see it today was very much a recent phenomena when you talk about the history of the United States. But in the 1960s, you had this emergence of cultural nationalism, which also coincided with the civil rights movement. You had groups like the Black Panther Party, right? You had black feminism that started to uprise, right? So you had this critical consciousness among African Americans about their condition within the United States. It was this idea that we were promised liberty, life, right? Freedom, the pursuit of justice, right? The pursuit of happiness. And even with civil rights legislations being passed, that did not occur. So during the cultural nationalism era, even though you had blacks who were allowed to integrate into historically white institutions, they were met with staunch backlash, right? This idea that just because I'm a talented athlete, it doesn't exclude me from being called the N-word. It doesn't exclude from me when I go into social spaces, they tell me you're not welcome here. I will cheer and clap for you when you're on the court. I will make you feel like you're worth something and you're validated when you're performing for me. But after that, you go back to being inferior, right? These points are, so cultural nationalism was this idea that we're going to challenge that. Even though we're on the podium at the Olympics in Mexico City in 1968 and we just won the gold and bronze medal, we're going to raise our fists because our struggle, even though we have these medals on our neck, are not separated from the communities from which we came, right? This idea that you're a Sambo or you're a brute. A brute, you are black, you're threatening, you're hypersexual, you're criminal. Therefore, we have to have means to control you, right? The way we control you, we'll put a helmet on you. You're being yelled at by a coach. The way we control you is to mass incarcerate you. The way we control you is to tell you that you have a learning disability when you do not. Because now you begin to internalize that you have something wrong with you. So these performative black masculinities, as it pertains to the brute, you'll see black males enact that behavior. Okay, you tell me I'm that, I'm going to do that. I begin to believe that that's who I am. The Sambo is the other caricature that's highlighted. The Sambo is this jovial image, right? This idea that I'm just happy to be here. I'm just going to go along with it, right? I'm going to entertain you, right? And you see that in the performances of black males in and through sport as well. White gazers and phobic and erotic obsessions. So there is this duality that occurs here. There's this phobic and this eroticism when it comes to black males, right? This phobic is, I don't like that, I don't want that near me. But there is this eroticism that there's something about blackness, this erotic appeal that whites are attracted to, right? What else would explain when you talk about Division I athletics, when many of these teams are majority black and the black male enrollment at these institutions is less than 2% in many of these schools, less than 6% in many of these schools, right? But you have thousands of people coming to watch them play, right? There's this eroticism there, right? But there's also the phobic. So we talk about that. And as I mentioned before, I conclude chapter 1 talking about the seriousness of this issue. We have several black males who have lost their lives, and many people say that it's separate from sport. I could talk about CTE in football and how that has led to literal deaths. I could talk about black males who have died because of the pressure associated with sport and taking their lives. And I'm going to highlight some later. I could talk about figurative deaths. The idea of the figurative death is that what about the holistic individual that you were destined to be that no longer lives now because you've been miseducated? Right? You're not even in that AP class. You're not even considering going to certain schools because you figuratively have been killed. Right? You didn't even get to tap into that holistic excellence that you had. Right? So we talk about the seriousness. So all of what I'm talking about, it's not about sports as entertainment. It's about life and death. For all of my educators, and I told you I would shout you out over here, who's looking to be an educator, chapter 2 digs deep into the idea of systemic miseducation in schooling. This idea that oftentimes we talk about what happens at the intercollegiate level and the adult level, that type of miseducation occurs earlier in life. And unlike the dominant narrative that says it's because of the black parents, it's because black students don't want to learn, they don't. What I talk about is this idea of different ways of learning, right? What I talk about is how is the education structured and why are we teaching certain things and why are we not teaching certain things, right? If I only see somebody in the classroom who doesn't look like me, I don't see curriculum that reflects to my day-to-day experiences, right? Soon to be Dr. Wadike talking about culturally relevant pedagogy, why that's important, right, to have inside of the classrooms. So the difference between schooling and receiving an education is different. You can go to school and earn a degree, doesn't mean that you're educated. To be educated is to critically think, to ask questions, right, to engage in behaviors that change the reality, not just perpetuate the reality. The structural intersectionality and the education debt, structural intersectionality, a term that was coined, not only coined by, but used by Dr. Tyrone Howard. He is a professor at UCLA, does extensive research on black males in urban contexts, and education debt by Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's also one of the pioneers of critical race theory in education. And essentially both of those theories talk about how the intersection of politics, education, healthcare, all of these decisions are made, and we can talk about in our modern day society how public education is no longer becoming a public good. We're becoming increasingly privatized. So what does that mean? Your ability to be educated is based on the neighborhood you live in. It believes on how much education or how much economic resources your parents have, right? And once again, black males are impacted by this. So that means that those resources are going somewhere, oftentimes not in communities where many black males are living and trying to receive an education. Miseducation through black males through youth and interscholastic sport. William C. Roden, the author of $40 Million Slaves, talks about this concept of the conveyor belt. It's this idea when black males at a young age are identified as having some type of athletic physical prowess, they're put into this system of youth elite sports, AAU, Pop Warner football, right? These elite showcases, right? Remember how I told you, getting back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, what was the connection for black males getting in sport in the first place, right? I get better treatment. I get resources. I get attention. So it's human dignity, it's positive identity affirmation, and it's social support. Almost the exact opposite what you would see in an educational context, unless we're talking about select educational contexts that are Afrocentric in nature or in elitist educational spaces. So the conveyor belt says we're going to take these talented athletes out of these communities. We're not going to be concerned with where they came from. We're going to take them. We're going to give them Nike gear, Under Armour. We're going to set them on this path. They're going to make a whole lot of money. And by doing that, we're going to distract the masses that inequality doesn't exist anymore, right? How can inequality exist? President Obama was the president, right? LeBron James is making millions of dollars. Black males aren't being exploited. That's how the conveyor belt works. the miseducation of black males through college, sport, institutionalized exploitation. So there was a concept by these professors, Dr. Patricia and Peter Adler. They did a longitudinal study in the 1980s looking at black males, not only black males, but Division I basketball players at a Division I institution. And what they found is that when they enrolled in the school, they had academic idealism. They said, you know what, I really want to major in this, engineering, I want to major in business, and they were really excited about pursuing their education. But through the socialization that they experienced at that institution, they got coaches saying, hey, you can't major in that because it conflicts with practice schedule. They got tutors saying, that major might be too hard for you, right? That maybe you should try this path. And so they experienced this idea of role engulfment. Role engulfment is when we all have multiple roles that we fulfill in our lives. Think about all the family members you have, all of your friends. You're a student, many of you students, employees, leaders, global citizens. You have multiple roles that you fulfill. Role engulfment is when you identify primarily with one role to the detriment of your other roles. Well, when I was reading that study, I said, wow, that really describes it. But I said, it doesn't quite get deep enough for me, right? You're talking about just within the intercollegiate context, and I know as a black male that my experiences didn't just begin or end when I was an athlete in college, right? There was something else going on. So I introduced this concept called the black male athletic identity foreclosure and role engulfment, which is a theory of gendered racism, right? And gendered racism can work against black women in unique and distinct ways, and it works against black men in unique and distinct ways, right? And so I say the institution of sport perpetuates gendered racism, right? And it's this idea that when you've got a society where black males are more likely to be admitted to college, academically underprepared. You got a society where black males constitute, based on some metrics, nearly 1/3 of the prison system and constitute roughly 6% of the entire U.S. population, right? You're telling me that doesn't have anything to do with athletic role engulfment and identity foreclosure, right? When you talk about schools that have teams that are constituted of 70% or more of black males on the athletic teams, but in the general campus community, they're less than 6%. You're telling me that doesn't have anything to do with the athletic role engulfment, right? Not to mention the mortality rates, lower life expectancies, right? And a whole range of other health issues. So I talk about that in relation to why that identity, and I also talk about the history that I mentioned earlier, which the original theory doesn't talk about that. It doesn't talk about the inception of black males' introduction into sport and how that occurred during mass racism. Some of these other concepts, which I'm not going to go over extensively, but essentially talk about how the athletic industrial complex is designed to exploit black males for their athletic ability, for economic capital for white capitalists. Okay, so all of these practices, academic clustering, where over 25% of an athletic team is pushed into a certain major, right? That is intentional to say, you're not here to get an education. You're here to work for us on the field and on the court, right? In some cases on the ice, but you're here to get by and major in eligibility. And any of us know that just because you're eligible, some schools, the eligibility can be as low as a 2.0. And I do not assert that GPA translates to intellectual capabilities at all. I think some people may have seen Martin Luther King Jr. Day a couple weeks ago. They highlighted while he was at Morehouse, he only had 1 A the entire time he was at Morehouse. And look at his legacy. So you don't judge people based on certain metrics, right? This is where it gets back to the holistic individual. Martin Luther King knew that he had something holistic in him that transcended whatever his academic performance was. And that's not to belittle academic performance, but it's to say that it's only one way that measures certain performance levels. Chapter 3 talks about the range of theories that I use. I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to bore you, but they're very interesting and I'm very passionate about them. And during the Q&A, if you want to ask about them, I will break them all down for you. But what I say is, I know when you look at that, you're like, wow, Dr. Cooper, that's a lot of theories. Well, I would say when I was looking at research that looked at black males, I was saying it's not enough theories, right? You got a psychological theory that's supposed to explain all of the black male existence. And I'm like, psychology can't explain our existence in totality. Sociology can't explain our existence in totality. A gender theory doesn't explain our existence in totality. So what I'm arguing here is that, yes, this is complex because the individuals who are being studied are complex, right? This idea that you need multifaceted lenses. Also, one of the things I want to highlight, as I mentioned earlier, many of the theories that emerged were not grounded in research on black males. I intentionally incorporated theories that were not only grounded in black males, but research that I've been doing and my colleagues have been doing that are specific to black males who participate in sport. Okay, that is an important distinction to make. The socialization that occurs when you're involved in certain types of sport is very different than if you're not, right? Now, the larger stereotypes, which I'll get into momentarily, still play in, but the nature of the experience is different. So this is a very fancy chart. I know some of you are like, okay, here we go, Dr. Cooper, another complex thing, right? I'm going to try to make it a little less complex. We all live in multiple systems, right? If you think about it, when you were first born, what's the first system you were born into? Family, right? Where does your family live? Community. What is your community a part of? A city, a town, a neighborhood. What is that a part of? A state. What is that a part of? A nation. What is that a part of? The world, right? So there are multiple systems at play that influence how we identify ourselves, right? So all of this highlights previous systems. The original ecological systems theory was created by a professor named Uri Brofenbrenner, right? Of European descent, right? Looking at human development among children, primarily white children, right? You had two brothers, Edward and Lawson Bush, who said, hey, this theory is very useful, but we've got to look at some nuances about African-American males. So there's an African-American male theory that they came up with that accounted for this idea of black cultural nationalism, that accounted for this notion of mass incarceration. But I'm going to take it a step further. We need to look at this idea of sport. Right? Let's look at how black males not only are part of systems in our broader society, but the role of sport. So if you look at the top right, left, or your right-hand corner, my left, not only do I talk about chattel slavery, the black liberation movement, the civil rights movement, right? Modern day Black Lives Matter movement, but also talk about the different waves of black athlete activism, right? This idea that blacks have always engaged in resistance in and through sport, just like we have in outside of society. Right? We strategically navigated oppressive systems that weren't designed for us to succeed. And oftentimes we decided we wanted to deconstruct those systems. Now, we don't want to participate. This gets into the heterogeneity of our people, right? This idea of how that works. So this is just a simplistic chart that I put together. There are 5 models that I'm going to briefly highlight, and then we'll get into the Q&A. The first model is the illusion of singular success, right? So that's the one that you all are probably most familiar with. Black males have this illusion of singular success through sport. I invest all my time in it. This is who I am. This is this is all of me. I explain how that happens, and it's not just because of their individual agency. I talk about the systems and the influences that would lead to the illusion of singular success happening, which leads to that black male athletic identity foreclosure and role engulfment at the end of their career, which can lead to acute and extensive depression. It can lead to death. Right? It can lead to unemployment, dissatisfaction, right? Emotional trauma in relationships, right? So these things have a major influence. I talk about the elite athlete lottery model, right? So in the book, I talk about there's around 21 million black men in the United States, or black males in the United States, right? And so if you were to have and take all the black males in the NFL and the NBA, right? And even if you were to start it at the eligible age to be in the NBA and the NFL, and you were to divide that number, and even if you took all the black males who participate in professional sports internationally and divide from the United States who participate internationally, the number of black males divided by that 21 million would be a fraction, a very, very, very minuscule number. But many of you in this room couldn't name the same number of black male engineers, even though there's multiple, over 10 times over black male engineers than there are professional athletes. You couldn't name black doctors, couldn't name black male lawyers. Right? So we primarily identify, so I talk about how elite individuals who are elite athletes, how they experience certain experiences. So even though they're a minute percentage, their experiences matter too. And they are not monolithic either. So I talk about that. The transition recovery model, all of my collective uplift family definitely is familiar with this, right? The transition recovery model talks about black males who've been socialized early on to view themselves in sport, but through the range of supports, through significant others, through family members, through being involved in study abroad, internships, exposure to things that tap into your holistic identity, even though you experience an identity crisis like Dr. Cooper did, you transition into your holistic identity, right? So you weren't able to avoid all the challenges of it, but you were able to tap into that in some way so that you didn't experience a literal holistic death. Sport is a means to an end, not an end in of itself. And there are numerous black males, I would argue Majority of black males fit the transition recovery model or the purposeful participation for expansive growth model, even though all of us in this room are most familiar with the illusion of singular success and the elite athlete lottery model. So this idea that I was always participating in sport for something else. Yes, I got a scholarship, but I also got my engineering degree, right? I'm going to talk about Emeka Okafor, UConn alumnus, right? Idea, graduated from UConn, nearly 4.0 GPA in finance. Also was a national champion, also was the number 2 draft pick in the NBA draft, right? But his identity wasn't just playing the sport. He came here to get an education. His father made sure of that. And we're going to talk about that, and his mother as well. The last model is the holistic empowerment model. So when we think about athletes who have a pronounced level of social consciousness, doesn't mean that the other models they don't, but there's a pronounced level of sociocultural consciousness that happens through certain types of socialization. Talk about Paul Robeson. Talk about Dr. Harry Edwards. We talk about Muhammad Ali. These are individuals who experience that type of socialization. So in chapter 4, I highlight not only the story, so this is another unique facet of the book. It doesn't just rely on anecdotes and narratives. It also relies on empirical data and studies that have studied black males, right? That move beyond the stereotypes, but actually engage in studying and understanding quantitatively and qualitatively. So I'm not going to go through all the studies right now. I will highlight one just to kind of give you the idea of the story. Kevin Ross was a player at Creighton University in the late 70s, early 80s, spent 4 years at Creighton. After he graduated from the institution, he wasn't able to play professionally, and he was functionally illiterate. And if you think this is something that only dates back to the 1970s and 1980s, I'll give you a more recent example that I highlight in the chapter. Malcolm Mitchell, who went to my alma mater, the University of Georgia, stayed at Georgia for 3 years. He was on the New England Patriots Super Bowl team, and when he was in the NFL, he described how he was reading at a 4th grade reading level, right? So how do you go to the University of Georgia, which is considered one of the most elite, prestigious institutions in the entire country, right? But you are not able to read well. Tell me how many of you in this room think you would have got into UConn if your reading level was diagnosed and identified to be at a 4th grade reading level? Nobody's raising their hand. So why would it be okay for a black male athlete to be admitted to the school for that purpose? Might be because the University of Georgia generates $93 million because of their football program. Maybe, right? And that may be connected to the larger state economy, right? But what about the black males who are essentially casualties in this process? Malcolm Mitchell was fortunate enough to make the NFL. What about some of his teammates who didn't? What about their story? So I talk about that. Kevin Ross actually attempted suicide 5 years after he had left the Creighton University. Thankfully, it was an unsuccessful attempt. He subsequently learned how to read. He got married, had 3 children, and now he's making an impact, using his story to impact others. So later he fit into the transition recovery model, what I call a progressive adapter. They're early adapters and progressive adapters to transition. He was a progressive adapter because it took him an extensive period of time to experience that transition. But the magnitude of his illusion of singular success was such that it was important to be in that section there. This is just a model. As I mentioned earlier, even though all of these factors influence black males, if you pay attention, there are certain factors that are bolded because based on the model, that ideology, that system, that process had a particular impact on black males who experienced that socialization. So I'll read off a few. White racism, capitalism, athletic manifest destiny, muscular assimilationism, right? The conveyor belt, right? Athletic role engulfment. So those who experience illusion of singular success, those impact their experiences more prominently than those who do not. The second one, elite athlete lottery model. You got pictures of LeBron James, Kevin Durant. Both of them grew up in humble beginnings. Akron, Ohio, the DMV area, Prince George's County. Both of them raised by their mothers, right? So this idea that their fathers weren't present had a connection to do with broader systemic racism that oftentimes takes black men physically outside of the household. And let's not conflate the idea that because black men aren't there physically doesn't always mean that they're not there emotionally, financially, in other ways, right? That's another stereotype that we have to start to really understand. How true is that? Does it happen? Does it exist? Of course, right? But so does police brutality, right? So does racist stop and frisk, right? So does this idea of the drug trade. Drugs can't be grown in these communities. Where are the drugs coming from, right? So that's a whole nother story, but getting in back, I digress. right? So these individuals, not only were they in predominantly black communities, but think back to the concept of the conveyor belt. They also were extracted out of those communities. LeBron James went to St. Vincent St. Mary, an elite private school in Akron, Ohio. Kevin Durant went to Oak Hill Academy, went to several National Christian Academy, several elite schools. So these are white private schools, right? If they would have stayed in their neighborhoods, they would have went to predominantly black public high schools. And I would like to believe that if they stayed in those, they probably still would have experienced the same level of athletic success, right? I'm not under the impression that those elite white private schools made them that much better of athletes. But what did it do? It gave them more exposure, right? So what does that psychologically tell you? I have to leave my community and go to people who don't look like me in order to experience this level of success. Well, then you have to ask yourself, why would that have to occur? You have to get into the deeper reason. So I talk about that. Both of them are also what I call leveraged capitalists with collectivist inclinations. And what that means is there are many black male elite athletes who acquire a significant amount of money, not necessarily wealth, right, but a significant amount of money in a very short period of time. But due to the fact that that may be the first time that they have acquired those kind of assets, they have people influencing them, sport agents, other people telling them spend your money in these ways. And oftentimes, a recent study said within 2 years after retiring, 60% of NFL players are bankrupt. And within 5 years, 70% of NFL players within 2 years and 60% of NBA players within 5 years of retirement are bankrupt. Right? So we look at all this money that they're making, but it's in a very short period of time. So that's where the miseducation occurs. Everybody says, well, hey, if I got that kind of money, I would be rich. Well, that same thing applies to people who win the lottery. There are numerous studies that show that people that win the lottery within 5 years, they're back in the same socioeconomic status that they were. So just because they experienced this short amount of glory, think about that though. Now you've got all this glory. When all that money goes, when that spotlight goes, where does that leave you? Telling me that won't be traumatic, right? We don't talk about this in a trauma way. But I call them leverage capitalists because both of them have engaged in acts to give back to their communities. LeBron James has his I Promise Foundation. He's built a school in his local community. Kevin Durant just donated $10 million to Prince George's County to help rebuild a recreation and educational facility in his community. So those are individuals who have experienced that. Antoine Walker and Lawrence Phillips didn't have the same fate. Antoine Walker amassed over $180 million in his professional career and experienced bankruptcy. Right? Subsequently experienced a lot of personal challenges, right? He goes around to colleges and universities now and talks about his experience, but how do you make $10 million every year and then you experience bankruptcy? Lawrence Phillips, talented, he was a member of the 1994-1995 University of Nebraska football team. They won the national championship 2 years in a row, first round draft pick in the NFL. But throughout his life, he experienced trauma as a child. That went undiagnosed. Hey, you're good at football. Don't worry about the fact that you had some abuse in your life. Don't worry about the fact that your father was incarcerated. Don't worry about these other factors. So when he got to college, what happens? He experiences other domestic violence incidences, other type of issues off the field. Well, guess what? Nebraska's winning, so we're gonna keep it going. It's okay, it's okay. He subsequently was incarcerated and he committed suicide while he was incarcerated. Right? So this is an elite athlete lottery model. This kind of fractures our dominant narrative that just because LeBron James and Kevin Durant made it, that all black males who experience professional athletic success, whether short-term or long-term, we assume that they're all okay, and that's not the case. So this is the ecological systems model that highlights the factors regarding that. Transition recovery model. I shout out to Collective Uplift, as I mentioned earlier, those involved in Collective Uplift. The founding members of Collective Uplift, some of them who are here today, shout out, I can't remember, Deshaun, Michael, Big Rich, Angelo, I can't remember if anybody else is out here. But it's important that I acknowledge them because they're very important. All of them were involved in co-founding Collective Uplift because they saw the light at the end of the tunnel during their athletic careers, and they felt like something wasn't right. They felt like I'm missing something here. I'm at a prestigious institution. I thought I was going to go to the NFL. Some of them actually did participate in the NFL, right? But now they're out of the NFL and they're still in their 20s. So they got the rest of their lives to live when they dedicated so much of their time to football. So they experienced the transition recovery model. These are a couple of the other individuals whose stories are very powerful that I highlight in the book. All of them experienced significant trauma. Marcus Lattimore was one of the top running backs in the United States in 2011. During a catastrophic injury in a game, he fractured his knee, and his leg was actually bent out this way. Think about somebody who was on the level of Reggie Bush, somebody on the level of Ezekiel Elliott, right? And he grew up in Duncan, South Carolina, where in the South, football is akin to a religion, right? So to experience that level of success, and now you're no longer able to perform at the same level, think about how traumatic that is. He subsequently was able to transition healthy by virtue of his spiritual faith, his family, other individuals in his life, earned his degree in public health from South Carolina, director of personal development with the football team there, so using his story to impact the next generation in a positive way, and he also has his own foundation. This is the ecological systems model for transition recovery model. Purposeful participation. I know many of you, as I highlighted Emeka Okafor's story, so I'm going to highlight Kylan Moore's story. Kylan Moore grew up in South Los Angeles, right? Not too far from Compton, right? His father was incarcerated, but through his mom's dedication, his mom earned multiple advanced degrees while she was raising him, his brother, and his sister. Kylan Moore, the statistics from where he grew up, he's not supposed to make it. Not only did he not make a Division I roster, or not only did the initial school that he went to, he didn't stay at that school, he ended up transferring to a smaller school and then went back to a Division I school, finished up his football career, and in 2017, he was a Rhodes Scholar, right? He's finishing up his graduate degree in Latin American Studies out in Oxford, and he's interested in pursuing his PhD, right? So this is somebody who, by stereotypical standards, he's supposed to be illiterate. He's supposed to be a criminal, right? Contrast to that, Myron Rowe, right? His family is from the Bahamas. He grew up in New Jersey, exceptional scholar athlete, performed well both on the field and in the classroom, graduated from Florida State, went on to the NFL, played 2 years in the NFL, went on, became a Rhodes Scholar, got his graduate degree in medical anthropology, and now he is a neurosurgeon doing his residency at Harvard University. Duke Slater, the first Superior Court Justice in Chicago in 1927 and 1929, he was the only black male in the NFL at the time, right? Graduated from the University of Iowa, he was an All-American and went on to have a successful career in law enforcement and criminal justice system, and then Emeka Okafor, who many of you all know. This is the ecological system for that model. And then holistic empowerment. So what I argue is that, there's this continuum, and all black males who participate in sport, it's not that we're always passive acceptors of the oppression that we experience. There are many of us who know full well what's going on, and we decide to say something about it and do something about it. We begin to question it. Paul Robeson, legendary athlete, one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, right? But was a staunch political activist, criticized American militarism, right? Said that this idea of stereotyping communism is an all bad thing, when here American capitalism and democracy isn't treating those who are the most disadvantaged too well, right? He had his passport stripped from him. His name was removed from the Rutgers University record books, right? But his legacy still lives on. He had a profound impact on Dr. Harry Edwards, who is arguably the founder of sports sociology, right? Wrote the book, The Revolt of the Black Athlete. When Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists in the 1968 Olympics, Dr. Edwards, they were involved in Dr. Edwards' organization called the Olympic Project for Human Rights, right? So all of these individuals, and many of you know Muhammad Ali, right, declined to go to the draft in 1967, said, I'm not going to Vietnam to go kill other brown and black people when black and brown people here in the United States are being treated as less than human, as second-class citizens, right? Even if it means me giving up my title at the height of my career, right? So this holistic empowerment involves a level of consciousness about exploitative systems. It also involves internalized empowerment, that I have the ability to change this in some way, shape, or form, and it involves conscious engagement in counteractions against the oppressive forces. So this is the model here for a holistic empowerment model. And the final chapter, chapter 9, is Sustained Empowerment, The Unbreakable Legacy Continues. Just present some ideas that I've muddled over, thought about. This is not an exhaustive list. None of us has all the answers. It takes a collective to have those answers. But I present ideas that I feel like are grounded in my philosophical, my epistemological, right? And once again, I'm sorry for throwing some of these terms out there. If you have questions, I can get into them later. Underpinnings about the way in which I view the world. Right? So this idea of what I was studying, I was trying to understand not only what happened to me, but what's happening to so many black males. Keep in mind, what I was highlighting in this book talks about patterns. I wasn't just talking about individuals. I talked about individuals in terms of their experiences, but they were a part of a collective pattern, right? And understanding what conditions facilitate holistic development and empowerment and true education, and what conditions facilitate holistic underdevelopment exploitation, and underdevelopment. So I provide recommendations for holistic individuals, families, and communities. I provide recommendations for the primary, right? When we talk about elementary school, we oftentimes omit that when we talk about athletics, but a lot of the socialization happens at that level. There was several years ago, they did a study in California where they were deciding on how many prisons to build based on the third grade reading levels, right? So don't tell me that lifespan outcomes aren't connected, right? It's this idea because they could predict what the high school dropout rate would be. Guess what the high school dropout rate transitions into? This idea of if you've got less access to the mainstream U.S. economy, you have to survive, so you're going to engage in activities that are deemed quote unquote illegal or criminal, right? So they were able to do that. So I talk about where we need to really think about early on at the elementary school level, pre-K level, what type of messages are we sending? What type of supports are provided, right? No child, no black male should be able to participate in a sport until they have reading proficiency. That means that you're valuing their literacy more than their athletic ability. Now, you can use athletics as a means to incentivize and motivate them, but there's no reason why you should be traveling across the country participating in these showcases when you're 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, but you're not performing well in the classroom. Because as we talked about earlier, the elite athlete lottery model, a very small percentage end up having careers in that. And even the ones that do, it's a short career. So how are you preparing these individuals for life? It's not just about putting a ball in a hole, not just about running down the field. You should be participating in sport as a form of empowerment. Secondary miseducation at interscholastic level, I talk about middle school and high school reform ideas, and then the post-secondary miseducation and intercollegiate athletics, and then the broader society. So I talk about this idea that ownership matters, right? We really got to think critically about if there are systems in place where we don't have ownership, where we're not being represented, we're not being treated fairly, how much do we want to continue to fuel this system, right? I think it's important for some of us to be in those systems to enact change, but I also think it's important for us to think about and imagine what a different society would look like not operating within those systems. So I want to thank you all for your time. There's, like I said, the book's back there. It's on Amazon, and I'll stop for questions.
I just want to give everyone an opportunity to come in if you want to. We're going to do a Q&A. We also have cake, so don't leave. And then I have to take it home, and I can't eat all that. So we'll have that towards the end of the Q&A as well. And you can see Liz with the books in the back after the Q&A, and then there'll be the book signing up front. Take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Can we just give Dr. Cooper another round of applause? What an amazing accomplishment. We all know, as we can see, this is a topic that he's very passionate about. This might be the shortest that he's ever been when talking about this topic. I might not have been there at 3:30 a.m., but myself and many of you have been on the receiving ends of emails telling us to read different papers he's written. So thank you again for being such an inspiration to us all. Your passion, exuberates the room, and just continue to do what you do. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of tonight's event. I'll get started with the question, but could you please raise your hand? I'll bring the mic to you. Stand and speak loudly so we can hear you. Okay? So the first question I have for you, Dr. Cooper, based on the findings of your research, is restructuring the athletic programs from top down the solution, or should student athletes also be held accountable?
Great question. And this is a question that's particularly relevant to Angelo, because when we first met, I was talking to Angelo about college athletes being paid, about college athletes, particularly black male college athletes, not getting enough. And Angelo was like, nah, Dr. Coop, like we get a lot. We get Nike gear, we got tutors, we get all this. Like, nah, Dr. Coop, we get enough, man. The black male athletes, they just need to work harder. They need to take advantage of the opportunity. They got all these resources. It's not a system, Dr. Coop. What I would say is that there's multiple parts. Agency always plays a part, but behavior is preceded by cognitive functioning and understandings about what you're involved in. Get back to the quote, you don't know what you don't know. It's not that black males who are involved in athletics don't think that education is important. right? Are there a handful or a smaller number that do? Sure, but that goes across all racial groups, right? There are a lot of people who go to college because somebody told them to go. But it's this idea that for many, particularly those who are first generation, when you go to college and you're on an athletic team, you're trusting the academic support staff. You're trusting people to give you advice that you feel like will be helpful to you. If you don't know how to navigate that space and you say, okay, if they say, hey, all you have to do is be eligible, in your mind, unless you've been socialized to question that and say, okay, I don't need to just be eligible. I need to get involved in something other than athletics. I need to do more. You're going to do that. So I do think it's important for black males. So to Angelo's question, the first thing, there has to be a level of consciousness about the system in which you're operating in. If you come to college and the only thing you walk away with is a sheet of paper and a few friends, that school took advantage of you. If you go to college and you got a couple bowl game rings, a couple national championship, all conference rings, and you didn't gain any type of well-rounded education, that school took advantage of you. So that level of consciousness needs to be instilled before you step foot on that campus, right? So before we start blaming the athletes and blaming all students for saying, oh, you didn't work hard enough, working hard isn't always the answer. It's working smart too. I can work hard all day. I can run into this wall all day, harder than any of you work hard at anything in your life. How far in life is that going to get me though? It probably is going to get me CTE, right? My wife's not going to be with me no more. Like, babe, you got to pay these bills. You need to help out and do something. You run into that wall. I appreciate your hard work, but that's misplaced effort. So in order to have a compass, we need to understand the consciousness about what is your purpose there. And it's also about the consciousness of the other people that you're around, right? Everybody who's around you doesn't always have your purpose in mind. You see? Like you think that, oh, the coach, he's got my best interest. The coach gets paid to win games. I would love for him to have the passion I have for you, but that ain't what he gets paid for, and I definitely don't get paid what he gets paid, right? So you got to know that that may not be the coach's role in my life. That coach can play a role. That coach can help build my social capital, build my network. That coach can help me understand how to navigate that space, but that coach may not give me the cultural empowerment I need. That coach may not tell me that, hey, I need to pursue this internship. That coach is not going to tell me that I need to study abroad, right? That would be worth my time to go abroad for 2 weeks in May when I'm not doing nothing else, right? That could be a transformative experience and something I could put on my resume, right? My wife works in career development and talks about there are best practices, certain things that employers look for in terms of what an employee can come to the table with, right? Interpersonal skills, right? Ability to code switch, right? Professional demeanor, right? Understanding how to communicate and navigate different spaces. So I would say that it's a two-part process. It takes consciousness in order to influence the behaviors, and then it is ownership on the individual. But I really want us to move away from just blaming the individual without understanding the antecedents, right? Think about it, and I know this is a heavy one, but I think it's important. Think about it if I was abused as a child, right? And I was subjected to violence as a child. And I know many people say, why would you bring that up? Because this is very important, and it pertains to a lot of athletes. Some of the athletes I write about in this book, the reason why they got involved in football and boxing was because of some trauma that they had. They needed that as an outlet. But that outlet wasn't there to save them for their entire lives. It served a purpose for a particular point in time. But after they got aged out of it, after they no longer were valuable in that space, they still have that issue. They didn't get no therapy, right? They didn't get no other type of things that they need. So if I started the story with that individual engaged in a certain behavior, but I did not tell you about anything that happened before that, would you all think that that would make sense? And I would say that particularly when we talk about black male college athletes, before you judge what they're doing on this campus, ask yourself, what were the antecedents? What are the systems around them? Who's telling them what, right? Because it's hard for an athlete. Angelo can tell you, when I first came to him, he's like, Dr. Cooper, I hear this coach got me out of my neighborhood. So I'm going to initially trust him more than you because you give me good motivational speech, but you ain't really changing my life situation right now. Over time, because once again, it's this fertilizing effect. You plant seeds, it'll happen. Now, on the flip side of that, when you talk about the structural reforms, that absolutely needs to change, right? One of my doc students, Ajane, is doing research on the underrepresentation of black women in leadership positions, right? And the lack of diversity in leadership and administration. Representation matters. So if you don't have any black men as athletic directors, as academic support staff, right? As anything but just the associate head coaches and not the head coaches, yes, you're going to have some issues with a lack of cultural competency and cultural congruence. So I do think there needs to be structural reforms. I present ideas about there needs to be specific demands about how much time are we spending on our sport, how much time should we be able to spend outside of sport developing ourselves in other ways, right? How much time should we be involved in something like a collective uplift, right? How much time should we be coming to the African American Cultural Center? So I do think those structural reforms need to happen. Right? So it's both. It's not just individual agency. I think structural reform. And this is another thing I want us to think about. When we think about the issues that all of you are passionate about changing in society, there are multiple solutions to that topic. Right? It's not just one way of doing it. What works for one person, think about all of you who do well academically. The way you study works for you. The way somebody else study works for them. Does that mean that one way is better than the other? No, both of you all could have got the same grade because you needed something specific to you. And I look at solutions to this issue in that multifaceted way. So thank you for the question. Hello.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for yet another good presentation. I'm lucky enough to get those at least once a week. I'm a graduate student in the sport management program. My name is Arnold Kanyangonda, and so you've spoken about how we can't blame the athlete, and that's fine. You know, and you also mentioned a proverb that resonates with me because they say that it takes a village to raise a child. That resonates with me even more because I'm from Africa. Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so then what do we as a village do to raise these children? In the sense that, yes, there is the idea that sport is one way to make it, but we do know that only 2%, less than 2% of collegiate athletes, and that's all collegiate athletes, become professional in sports. That means 98% of all collegiate athletes, which means a slightly higher percentage, you do the mathematics, of all black athletes or black male athletes are going to wind up pursuing that as a sport. So now how do we as a village educate and socialize these young black males to know that this is something you could do, but it's a small percentage of what you could do. The example you gave, there are more than 10 times as many black engineers as there are black male athletes. You know, so that's the one side. And then on the other side, the idea that, okay, you've got a college scholarship. How do you educate people? How do we socialize people to think? I think perhaps the way it happened to you and I, because my dad was a professor too, and so I knew that yes, I could play college sports, which I did for a bit, but that was never going to be the only thing you're able to do. You know, so you are a true student athlete, you take your classes seriously, you take these engineering classes, you become like an American Okafor, but you also play sport the best. How do we as a village raise the young black male to know that you can, it's not just the only way to, it's not just that it can be done, but that you can do it. And then on a slightly unrelated thing, I work downstairs at community outreach. We got a lot of programs, and so shameless plug, Dr. Cooper, if you don't mind. On the topic of mass incarceration, we've got a film showing tomorrow of Life on Parole. You know, and it's important because that's one of the things that hamstrings too many young black males, both as victims of what I call the American penal system. I don't think it's a justice system, and also the young black males that should be raising. So I'm going to just pass out some flyers for that.
Absolutely. But black males have been viewed as sub and superhuman. And the problem with that framing is that they aren't viewed as human and requiring what humans would require for support and investment. So you're subhuman because somehow you're intellectually inferior, something's wrong with you all are getting arrested, you're graduating at the lowest rates, etc. You're superhuman because you're exceptional athletes and you're all this and that. I would argue what black males need are the same things that any other human being would need that's specific to them. So when you ask me that question, I think to myself, what does a young black woman, all the black women in the room here who are here for college who value education, what factors contributed to you being here? I could probably tell you. Somebody made it a priority. Somebody gave you exposure. Somebody provided you with support. Somebody reaffirmed your identity in that space. So the idea of it is the simple part. The implementation and execution is hard because the main thing that we omit when we do that, or when we don't do that, we don't think that there are oppressive forces at play, right? So we think that when we are complicit within this system, we're under the idea that if we just tell our village, everybody get an education, you're going to do well, everything's going to be all right. We don't tell them that when you go to school, that teacher may tell you that you're dumb. We don't tell them that when you go to college, they're going to try to sway you into another major, right? So some of our families do that, but I think we also have to have a realization about the oppression that we're dealing with. We got to have an honest conversation about the lineage of our people, be before chattel slavery, after chattel slavery, and up to this point. So we got an honest conversation that everybody in this society doesn't want us to win. Everybody wants you, there are people who intentionally want you to focus on your sport, and they're going to give you everything to focus on that. I'm going to give you a shoe endorsement deal. You're going to be great. I'm actually going to even let you be the one who made it. And you're going to feel good about that, right? What did OJ say? I'm not black, I'm OJ, right? That's what they're going to do. But you got to have that socialization that says, it's not just about me, number one, and my investment and my holistic development is about the collective for our people. So I would argue that from a humanistic standpoint, the things that black males need are the same thing that any other human being needs. Needs to have priorities, needs to have exposure, needs to have support, needs to have identity affirmation, right? I tell black, collective uplift, they could probably recite this without me even finishing it. I said, why were you great in your sport? Many of them think for a minute, after we go through the collective uplift thing, they say, I put time into it, I focused on it, I believed I could do it, and it was something that I was not going to be denied. So I said, okay, what about being an engineer? Why wouldn't that apply? Right? What about going to med school? Why wouldn't that apply? Right? Who's going to stop you there? Who's going to stop you from owning your own sport team? So even if you do go into sport, don't let the sport use you. I don't mind if you become an athlete, but I would like to see you become a head coach. I would like to see you become owning your own sport agency. I would like to see you educate the next generation about the process. So it's not that sport is innately bad, but there are some people who are governing sport and organizing sport who do not care about your holistic well-being. And we got to have that conversation. So while we're talking about education, working hard, building wealth, dealing with some of the trauma in our communities, that's another big one too, is that before we even get to that, there's some trauma that we're dealing with. There's a reason why a lot of black families are complicit in this, because they say that, look, in my community, I was going to talk about T.A. McClendon there. He's from Albemarle, North Carolina, small rural North Carolina. He was one of the most decorated running backs in U.S. football history. They got more attention during his high school career than any other time in recent history. So that community is looking at me like, yeah, we got some students we send to college, but the news wasn't giving us coverage for that. People, coaches from all across the country. So there's some legitimate reasons why there's an investment in sport, but we have to talk about the realities of how that's oftentimes short-lived and that sport has to be a means to an end, not an end in of itself. And we have to start thinking the mentality that how do we own what we do? Because even if you make it to the professional level, somebody else owns you. Right? So, people always talk about like LeBron James is a millionaire. I'm like, yeah, the owner is a billionaire, right? And none of the owners are black except for Michael Jordan, right? So at least in the NBA in that case. In the NFL, none, no black owners. So the question becomes, we have to get to a higher level of thinking about it's more than just our participation, right? And the way you do that is honor the holistic individual. And I talk about that in the chapter. Don't just identify yourself as an athlete. Any of the collective uplift members, I ask them, who are you? They're going to list off 10 things before they mention that they played their sport, because that's who they are. The athlete is what they did, right? It's a part of them. It's not all of them. So that type of socialization along with supports, and it's an uphill battle. Like I said, for one, we've been set back through systemic efforts. Like there are real oppressive forces that have set us back. On top of the fact, it takes some time to get there, but I think every little bit helps. And we have to be the change that we seek to be in the world. So once you acquire more knowledge and information and empowerment, you've got to instill that in somebody else. I always tell people, tell me the 5 closest people around you and I'll tell you what you're doing with your life, right? It's this idea that if you're the only one in your crew who's doing something positive, you aren't empowering your crew, right? Everybody in your crew should be talking about, hey, I'm involved in this and I'm doing this and I'm impacting change and I'm volunteering and I'm mentoring, right? You shouldn't be the only one doing that. So that's that point. Great question, Arnold. I appreciate it. And definitely go to his event. I think Justice in Akuma.
Peace and love. I appreciate this gems of wisdom. I can't wait to dive into it. My question is this: what currently is Collective Uplift, and what's it going to become?
Great question. Collective Uplift currently right now is a holistic development support program. So we started off as a psychosocial support group. So it started off really informal. A lot of people have ideas like, all right, let's go ahead and build it. And for me, I was more like, I just want to understand what the black males at UConn who are involved in athletics are experiencing. And as we talked, organically, it became something bigger. Because initially it was like, let's just come and talk on a weekly basis. I just want to expose them to some new ideas, kind of want to plant seeds in them. I don't want to force them to want to do something before they're ready for it. And that's another thing that we have to understand. When you're trying to help people around you, they may not always be ready for it at the time. It took me a long time before I came to my realization, but it's because the village had poured into me years before that. They knew the light bulb wasn't going to come on when I was playing against Chris Paul. They knew they couldn't tell me nothing. Nobody could tell me I wasn't going to make the NBA, right? Nobody, right? And I still feel that way now, baby. You know, watching the All-Star game last night. You know, I was telling Monique, I was supposed to be out there with Giannis, baby. So you have to just plant the seed and allow it to grow. So that's what Collective Uplift started. We do have a chapter at Old Dominion. Josh Mariner, he's a UConn graduate. He started a chapter at Old Dominion. A colleague of mine who's at Texas Southern University, it's the second largest historically black university in the country. He started a Collective Uplift there. So right now we're trying to build chapters at institutions of higher learning. Mike Davis is here from Eastern Connecticut, Eastern ECSU, and he's a former athlete, and he's looking to help build and nurture that there. So we're looking to spread that consciousness at that level, but we also have built it as an organization that we're looking to reach those at the youth level. So Angelo has been leading the effort to start Collective Uplift as an LLC, and primarily what we would like to do is, it's not about like a for-profit money thing. It's about, because there's certain things that we need to provide to our people that we shouldn't charge for. And that's a big thing of mine. It's like, if this is something that's that important, we shouldn't always charge for it. There are other things that once we provide at a certain level, we should support each other. That dollar should move around in our community before it goes out. So we're looking to build it so that we're enhancing that consciousness at the elementary school level, the middle school level, and the high school level. So it started out as a student. It is an official UConn student organization. And like I said, we have it at ODU and TSU. So that's going to continue on. As long as I have anything to do, we're going to keep building that. And then we want to expand it because the Collective Uplift members, they said, Dr. Coop, this is great that we're getting this now, but you know, we needed this before. There's so many of our brothers who were in the community before they didn't get here. They need to hear this. So we're working on building that communication. And Collective Uplift isn't just Collective Uplift. It's engaged, it's tied into the same work that you're doing, the transformative hip hop education that you're involved in. And that's the way that we have to look at this thing. It's the same thing as Taj being an entrepreneur while he's still being a student here at UConn. And our organizations, if we're not in concert with our collective mission, then I think our efforts are very much minimalized. Doesn't mean that it doesn't make a difference at all, but I think we optimize it when we say that hip hop education, when we talk about African American Cultural Center, ASA, YSO, etc. All of us, we are all one, right? We're all trying to maximize our development as a people, right? But we got to understand that there's certain conversations that need to happen in certain spaces, right? So when SIS has a meeting, Sisters Inspiring Sisters, there's a specific space for that. And they need that. But SIS isn't disconnected from Collective Uplift. The president of Collective Uplift, Batuli Kamara, is on the women's basketball team. And we started out as an all-male group, right? So this is how we expand, because we said it ain't just about the males. If we're not reaching with our sisters, then we're not empowered ourselves. We can't always have these separate programs. There got to be times we having conversations together. How are you developing your gendered identity? How are we loving and supporting each other? Because if I'm wrestling with something, that's going to affect my relationship with you, right? And vice versa. So yeah, so that's what we're doing. So I would say Collective Uplift is not just the entity in of itself. As long as you got passionate, positive agents of change, that's what Collective Uplift, we're going to be out here doing it as long as we can, and in whatever format we need to. Okay. You know.
Akuma, Dr. Hooper is a doctoral student. I'm a PhD candidate. So I feel that I've been hearing about this for like 3 years. But thinking about the exploitation, getting back to empowerment, and hearing a lot about capitalism, but also it takes a village, and understanding that this American village is kind of run by white people. Where do they fit in this system? What is their role, responsibility, or accountability in getting us back to where we need to be? Because in my head, America never really existed for us. Okay. So there's nothing really for them to, in theory, get back to as a paradigm. So where are we going?
Right. No, that's a deep question. Deep question, because as Akuma's alluding to, I always tell students there's a 1619 when they dated back to the first Africans being brought here and enslaved. The United States wasn't founded. The Constitution wasn't signed until 1776. Right. So you're talking about over 150 plus years of legalized slavery before the country was even founded. 1776 to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, another close to 100 years of legalized enslavement. So blacks being treated as property, right? From 1865 to the 1960s, the civil rights legislation, you still had separate and unequal, black codes, Jim Crows, lynching at all-time high rates. So to Akuma's point, white racism, capitalism, if we haven't got it yet, they benefit from us being miseducated, exploited, and engaged in our detriment, right? Because if we want to break the law, guess what? They're going to build prisons and make money off of that. If we just want to play sport and not be holistic individuals, they're going to build athletic teams and make money off of that, right? So we got to get to the point where we're like, okay, so if they're invested in our trauma, and because we make up the numerical minority in this country, we have to be very strategic about how do we navigate this space. All white people are not against black empowerment. It doesn't exist, but when you look at a lot of our advancements, a lot of people who've helped me get to where I am educationally, no doubt was the black village around me, but I had some very positive white allies, right? So we've got to kind of get out of the simplistic thinking of just because they're white that they can't do us any good. But we also have to have some honest conversations about what do we demand, right? So if we say that, hey, we're going to come to UConn, and if we say, hey, white coaches, white presidents, white faculty, this is what we want, and they show us that, hey, we're not going to give you that, then it's in our court about how do we still get what we need to get out of this arrangement. So I think there are going to be certain instances where there's going to be cross-racial collaborations that are very fruitful in terms of building foundations, in terms of building schools, in terms of building sporting spaces that are more holistic in their functioning. But I also think there's going to be staunch resistance against that. Right? We even saw with Kaepernick taking a knee. If the white masses were that okay with it, Kaepernick would still be in the NFL. Right? So the idea that we're going to convince a critical mass of the United States population, who many of them benefit up from a privilege that they didn't earn, to say that, hey, we're going to empathize with you, I just don't think on moral grounds that's going to happen. I think we've been trying to morally appeal for a long time. Doesn't mean we should stop, because there are some people who morally are going to be convinced. But I think we've got to be invested in ourselves more so than anybody else around us. So I think the work that you're doing, that all of my doc students are doing, many of you are going to occupy spaces that are white controlled. You're going to have the education, and you're going to have the ability to navigate that space in a way to leverage influence to impact our bottom line, right? Some people mischaracterize that, oh, you're selling out, oh, you're this and you're that. I don't adhere to that. My thought is, what is your core intention? And what are the impact that you're having? If you've got to navigate this white-controlled school district in order to fund more resources into our community, do that. But don't do it to the extent to where you're undermining the overall goal of our people. So I think that we just can't be disillusioned that all of them are going to want to help us. And that's where I talked about some of the alternative spaces, is that, we have to have a serious conversation. Should black college athletes go to these schools? Right? If they're not going to provide the recommendations you're going to outline in your dissertation, we need to have a serious conversation about, she's going to outline it. She's going to graduate in May, Dr. Wadike. If they're not going to do that, we've got to have some legitimate conversations about, is this the best place for us? Because we've got to make a stand and say, we value these things. And if you, regardless of your race, don't value, because think about it, other races do that. Right? If you don't give us this and that, we're going to go this way with it. Right? If that means we got to build our own schools, build our own businesses, do those things. So I think we've got to have those honest conversations, but don't be disillusioned that, everybody's not going to be on board. And there's always, Dr. Harry Edwards always says, there are no final victories. There is always going to be oppressive forces in society that are trying to minimize and take advantage of you. So we've always got to be vigilant. Not to the point that we don't enjoy life and we don't, relax, but we've got to be vigilant that, there are people who are invested because they benefit from our pain. They benefit from our miseducation. Like it's just, and because in their minds, they adopt that idea, well, oh, if you were that good, you would figure out a way to stop it, or you would work hard enough, right? So we gotta, have that kind of balance and that approach. So I appreciate that question. Any other questions? Oh yeah, got a couple.
So, I think one of the most impressive things you do in the book and with each model is you go through the entire lifespan of individuals, and you talked about it at the beginning with a lot of this research focusing on either when you're an athlete or immediately post that athletic career. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the importance of holistic individuals through the entire lifespan.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Max. Max is a graduate student in the sport management program, so promoting sport management. I want to thank all the students for being here, and we'll be enrolling in the doctoral program next year, so give it up for Max to be a PhD student. So as Max, some of the research that Max does is looking at how baseball players are socialized early on before they get to getting drafted into the major leagues, because many of you may know in baseball in the United States, they have a minor league system. So you can be drafted out of high school, or you can, go to college and participate in intercollegiate sport. So for Max's question around holistic development, for me, it has to start when you're young, right? It has to start that you're going to be involved in this sport, but it's something that you're doing. You're a holistic individual. This sport, there are specific things that you need to gain from being involved in this sport. You need to understand discipline, how to work well with others, how to set goals, how to overcome adversity. Because in all sports, you're going to be met with some adversity. Nobody is undefeated all the time, right? But that's a life lesson that is only activated if you make it transferable. Right? You got some of the most talented athletes in the world who are very resilient in sporting spaces, but you put them in a challenging environment outside of that, they give up like that. And it's like, well, hold on, like you was on the sport, like you couldn't be stopped because it wasn't activated to be transferable. So what I would say is early on, the holistic development has to be involved in sport. And even if you're going to have your children heavily involved in sport, talk to them more than just about the technicality of the game. Talk to them about, okay, we're going to this field here. Do you know whether the town owns this field or does somebody else own this field? What other events are hosted here? How did your coach get to be in that position? What are other people? So kind of ask those questions of them and socialize them to think about sport in a multifaceted way. So when they go play, it's like, hey, I'm not just playing the game. Like I'm actually understanding some of the other things that are going on. Obviously, it has to be developmentally appropriate, right? When Nia gets involved in sport, because she's going to at least start out in it. If she doesn't want to do it later, she can choose not to. But she's going to have... Nia's going to come to the AACC and talk about some holistic development, right? She's going to be on some like, hey, what type of strategic responsiveness are we engaged in, right? And y'all going to be looking at her like, little girl, hey, So I think that there has to be like intentionality early on. And getting back to Arnold's question, when you think about families that do that with their children, there are certain communities that they have generations of business owners within their community. And if you notice at these venues, they will have the children there working with them or at least shadowing, right? It's because that role model effect matters. So I would say the same thing has to be applied even if you have your children involved in sport. Role model to them that life is more than just about the sport. I love sport as much as anybody else does, right? But my connection to it isn't just about sport. It's about something bigger than the wins and losses. So I think that understanding that holistic identity development early on, being intentional about what are the routines, and I do think the time that you put your children in sport compared to what you give them other things, it does matter, right? If your child was involved in sports 40 hours a week, and then the other 10 hours were video games or whatever, and none of that was involved in doing any type of research projects, going to a museum, talking about other social issues in society, then you got to ask yourself, okay, because the whole cliche is, I can tell a person's values by where they spend their time and where they spend their money, right? So you could talk all day like, hey, I value this, I value that, I value this, I value that. But if I were to look at your life 24/7, what are you doing with your time? And then where do you put your money, right? Because if you buying all this other stuff, but you say, no, I value education, but you bought all this other stuff, right? That wasn't fueling education. So I think that kind of concept, that conversation has to happen early on as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. So my question, obviously the book is more about student athletes, but I'm curious to know to what extent the literature talks about people in administration and the way they fit into these models, and maybe as well how they internalize some of these factors that you've been addressing.
Excellent question. My doc students, Ajane and Akuma, and DJ, they're working on these areas now. This is the wonderful thing about being a faculty member, like, because you can't research everything, you got to have some doc students who are at that level getting it in. But that kind of ties into Akuma's question around, there's been a system that's been put in place to reward people in administration for producing certain outcomes. And we know what those outcomes are as it pertains to black students overall and black college athletes specifically. That requires, for one, I think many of them don't fully understand how the policies that they have and the practices embedded in their organization lead to these outcomes. Because many of them have been socialized to this idea that the outcomes we see in society are because people work hard enough or people deserve it. So that's many of their ideologies. Like, hey, you know, the reason why these black college athletes ain't graduating because they don't take study hall as seriously as the other ones. They don't think about some of the other factors that influence them. They don't think about, well, when they were sitting in that English class, the professor said, because you're a college athlete, anytime you're late or missing class, I'm not going to give you a chance to make up the work. They weren't thinking about their academic athletic support staff person who keeps telling the student, focus on eligibility, don't focus on. So a part of it means educating the administrators. And the only way you do that is that you've got to have data and studies and information that speaks their language, right? So this gets into the interest convergence, right? So we may want to go in there, kick the door down, but we're being oppressed. Y'all ain't doing us right. And I'll be right there with you, you know what I'm saying, fist up. But I just don't think David Benedict, Coach Aryema, Coach Etzel, you know, Coach Hurley, I don't think they're going to be like, okay, are you done? Thank you, and then exit. Whereas if you come in and you say, hey, I understand that you value wins and losses. I understand that you value, but have you thought about if you graduate more of your black college athletes, that actually could increase your recruiting, that actually could increase the institutional reputation, that actually could make your athletes become better on the court, right? Because if they're not dealing with some of the depression and some of the other issues that come from a lack of holistic development off the court, if you can create programs that fuel them holistically, then that could help enhance their performance. So I think, to your point, we definitely have to have administrators that are accountable. But I think back to the previous point I made is that some of them just don't know, and then some of them just don't care. And so for the ones that don't know, let's work with them, educate them, and try to work and explain to them in their language how this can happen if they were to invest resources in this way. For the ones that don't care, we seriously got to consider if those are the spaces for us. And we've got to call them out. Right? We got to say that, hey, we asked you to provide opportunities for these student athletes to study abroad, and you said no. So we're going to go to the Hartford Courant and say that we put a proposal to you that said UConn college athletes cannot go abroad when we know through research that that would enhance their, and as you know, you studied abroad. You know about how transformative that experience is. And so if you're not going to provide that, we've just got to start holding them accountable. And hopefully that momentum will lead to some changes. But if they aren't going to do that, then I think we need to go to these institutions where we do have administrators who are culturally responsive, who are focused on the holistic development of black college athletes. So that's a great question.
Thank you. Give it a round of applause. All right. So if you have more questions about the book?
Or office hours, 2 to
Office hours.
11 to 12. Like Angelo said, you're probably going to need more than an hour.
Email.
No, honestly,
Email.
just stop by, and I'd love to talk with you. You can email me, joseph.cooper. You know, come to Collective Uplift meetings. We meet Monday nights at 7 o'clock in the business school, room 202. So we delve into this every week. So we actually are going to have a conference in April. It's either going to be April 13th or 20th called More Than a Jersey that Collective Uplift is putting on. So stay tuned for more details about that.
Doesn't have Twitter quite yet, but we're working on it. So, or Instagram. Just Facebook, right?
Born in the 80s.
Yeah. All right. So we're gonna transition now to eating cake and the book signing. Liz is again in the back. If you need a book, we'll be up here signing. So if you could just kindly form a line down the center aisle if you want the book signed. And thank you all for coming. If we don't get to thank you personally, we really appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening.